The year was 1892, and the Arizona Territory still belonged more to ghosts than to men. This was a time when the frontier had begun to close in on itself, when the wild edges of America were being measured, mapped, and tamed by surveyors and railroadmen who believed they could draw straight lines through the desert and call it civilization. But there were places the maps could not account for, towns that appeared on no official register, settlements that existed in the spaces between what was known and what was whispered about in the dark hours before dawn. Redemption Flats was such a place. It sat in a basin of red rock and alkali dust, surrounded by mesas that looked like the broken teeth of some ancient sleeping god. The town had sprung up 8 years prior when a silver vein was discovered in the nearby Covenant Hills, and for a brief, fever-bright moment, it had thrived. Men came from as far as San Francisco and St. Louis, their pockets empty but their eyes full of that particular hunger that only the promise of easy wealth can kindle. They built their town quickly, carelessly, using whatever materials the desert provided and whatever could be hauled in by wagon train. The buildings leaned into each other like drunkards, their wood already graying under the relentless sun, their foundations settling unevenly into the caliche soil. By the time our story begins, the silver had played out. The richest veins had been stripped clean, and what remained was barely worth the dynamite it would take to reach it. The population had dwindled from nearly 2,000 souls to fewer than 300, and those who remained were either too stubborn, too poor, or too haunted to leave. The Chinese laborers, who had done much of the dangerous work in the deep shafts, had mostly departed, leaving behind only Old Wing and his grandson, who ran a general store that smelled of ginger and desperation. The prostitutes who had worked the cribs along Perdition Street had moved on to more prosperous camps, save for 3 aging women who now did laundry and mending to survive. The assayer's office stood empty, its scales rusting in the window like a memorial to abandoned dreams. But the Lucky Benediction Saloon remained open. It had to. A town without a saloon is not a town at all, merely a collection of buildings pretending at community. The Lucky Benediction occupied the corner of Main Street and what passed for 2nd Avenue, a 2-story structure with a false front that made it appear grander than it was. The paint, once a bold crimson, had faded to the color of dried blood. The 2nd floor, which had once housed private gambling rooms, now stood empty except for the rats and the memories of fortunes won and lost on the turn of a card. The proprietor was a man named Samuel Garrison, though everyone called him Sam, or, when they were feeling particularly familiar or particularly drunk, just Garrison. He was 46 years old, but looked 60, his face weathered into a permanent squint by years of sun and disappointment. He had come to Redemption Flats with nothing, and had managed, through a combination of hard work and moral flexibility, to acquire the saloon from its previous owner, a man named Daltrey who had been found face down in the street one morning, with a neat hole in the back of his head that had never been satisfactorily explained. Sam did not ask too many questions about his predecessor's fate. In the Arizona Territory, asking too many questions was a good way to become the subject of questions yourself. Sam ran the Lucky Benediction, with the help of his daughter Charlotte, a severe woman of 23 who had inherited her dead mother's dark hair and her father's pragmatic disposition. Charlotte had been born in Redemption Flats and had never known any other home. She had watched the town boom and begin its slow collapse, had seen men made and unmade by the silver that had promised everything and delivered only temporary reprieve from whatever they were running from. She kept the books, managed the inventory of whiskey and beer, and maintained a cool distance from the patrons that made it clear she was not one of the attractions, despite her youth and the scarcity of women in town. The 3rd member of the Lucky Benediction small staff was a Mexican man named Esteban Ruiz, who served as bartender, bouncer, and general factotum. Esteban was built like a bull, with hands that could palm a man's head and shoulders that strained the seams of whatever shirt he wore. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and had a way of ending disputes with nothing more than a look. He had been with Sam for 6 years, ever since drifting into town with no explanation and no past that anyone could verify. There were rumors about Esteban, of course. There were always rumors. Some said he had been a vaquero who had killed his patron in a dispute over wages. Others claimed he had been a mine foreman who had sealed men in a shaft during a cave-in to save himself. Esteban never confirmed or denied any of it, and Sam had long ago decided that a man's past was his own business, as long as his present was reliable. The piano had arrived on a Wednesday in late October. Sam had not ordered it, had not even known it was coming until the freight wagon pulled up outside the Lucky Benediction, and two teamsters began unloading a massive crate that bore shipping labels from St. Louis and Kansas City, and points east. The bill of lading was addressed to Samuel Garrison, Redemption Flats, Arizona Territory, and indicated that the instrument had been paid for in full, though by whom, the paperwork did not say. Sam stood in the street, the afternoon sun beating down on his hat, and stared at the crate with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. He had wanted a piano for the saloon for years. Music drew customers, made them stay longer, drink more, spend money they did not have on illusions of sophistication and culture. But pianos were expensive, and freight across the desert was even more expensive, and Sam had never had the capital to justify such a purchase. Now here one was, delivered like an answer to a prayer he had not quite gotten around to saying. The teamsters were impatient. They had a schedule to keep, other deliveries to make in other dying towns along their route. They needed Sam to sign for the delivery, and they needed him to figure out how to get the damn thing inside, because they were not being paid to do anything more than deliver it to the door. Sam signed, his hand moving slowly across the paper, as if the act of signing might somehow obligate him to something he did not yet understand. Then he called for Esteban and 3 other men from the bar, and together they wrestled the crate up the front steps, through the double doors, and into the main room of the saloon. It took them 2 hours to uncrate the piano and position it in the corner near the cold pot-bellied stove. When the last of the packing material had been pulled away and the protective blankets removed, they all stood back and regarded what had been delivered. It was a beautiful instrument, an upright parlor piano made of walnut with ivory keys that gleamed even in the dim light of the saloon. The wood was deeply figured, almost too ornate for a place like Redemption Flats, with carved scrollwork along the music stand and legs that ended in clawed feet clutching spheres. The manufacturer's mark inside the lid read Schiller & Sons, Boston, Massachusetts, and the serial number indicated it had been built sometime in the 1870s. Charlotte ran her fingers along the closed lid, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. She had never seen anything so fine in Redemption Flats. The piano seemed to belong to a different world, one of parlors and drawing rooms and ladies in silk dresses, not this rough place of dust and men who spat tobacco on the floor. She opened the lid and pressed a key experimentally. The note rang out clear and true, filling the saloon with a sound that seemed almost sacrilegious in its purity. That evening, Sam made inquiries. He asked every regular patron if they knew anything about the piano, if perhaps one of them had arranged its delivery as some kind of gift or joke. No one knew anything. He sent Charlotte to the Western Union office to see if any telegrams had come through regarding the shipment. There were none. He even visited Old Wing at the general store, thinking perhaps there had been some confusion with the paperwork, some mistake in addressing. Old Wing shook his head and offered only that sometimes the desert brings what is needed, not what is asked for, and that wise men do not question gifts, only use them well or poorly. Sam was not sure he believed in wisdom, particularly desert wisdom, but he also was not inclined to look too hard at good fortune when it appeared. The piano was here. It was paid for. It was beautiful. And the Lucky Benediction now had something no other establishment within 100 miles could offer. He decided to consider it a blessing and to proceed accordingly. The problem was that no one in Redemption Flats could play the piano. Sam could not. Charlotte had never learned. Esteban merely shrugged when asked, his expression suggesting that such refinements were not part of his history. They asked around town, but the remaining population was composed largely of miners, drifters, cowboys, and failed speculators, none of whom had spent their formative years at a keyboard. For 3 days, the piano sat in the corner of the Lucky Benediction like a promise unfulfilled, beautiful and silent and somehow accusatory in its muteness. Then, on Saturday night, a stranger came to town. He arrived on foot, walking down Main Street just after sunset with nothing but a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder and the dust of hard miles on his black suit. He was tall and thin, with long fingers that seemed almost delicate despite their length, and a face that was difficult to read. Pleasant enough but somehow forgettable, the kind of face that would blend into a crowd or disappear entirely from memory within hours of meeting. His eyes, though, were memorable. They were gray, the color of gunsmoke or rain over distant mountains, and they seemed to take in everything without lingering on anything in particular. The stranger entered the lucky benediction, nodded politely to Esteban behind the bar, and ordered a whiskey. He drank it slowly, standing at the bar rather than taking a table, and his eyes eventually found the piano in the corner. He regarded it for a long moment, long enough that Sam noticed and made his way over. Sam introduced himself. The stranger said his name was Thomas Lerner, and that he was traveling through on his way to California, though he was in no particular hurry to arrive. They exchanged the usual pleasantries that passed for conversation in such places, the ritual dance of strangers feeling each other out for threat or opportunity. When Sam mentioned the piano and the oddity of its delivery, Thomas Lerner smiled slightly and said that coincidence was a funny thing, as he happened to know his way around a keyboard. Sam's face brightened. Would Mr. Lerner be interested in playing for the evening, perhaps for his drinks and a hot meal? Thomas Lerner considered this, his gray eyes moving from Sam to the piano and back again, and then nodded. He finished his whiskey, set the glass on the bar with a soft click, and made his way to the instrument. He did not sit immediately. First, he walked around the piano, running his hand along its wood, examining it with an attention that suggested professional appraisal. He opened the lid, studied the keys, pressed several in sequence, listening to their tone. He tested the pedals, adjusted the stool, and only then did he sit down. His long fingers flexed once, twice, and then settled on the keys. What came forth was extraordinary. Thomas Lerner played with a technical proficiency that would have been impressive in a concert hall in Boston or New York, let alone a shabby saloon in a dying mining town in Arizona. He began with something classical that none of them recognized but that silenced the room completely. A cascade of notes that seemed to paint pictures in the air, images of grand ballrooms and candlelit evenings and lives lived far from the desert. Then he shifted into popular songs, pieces that the patrons did know, melodies that had drifted west from the music halls of San Francisco and the theaters of Denver. Stephen Foster tunes, marching songs from the war, drinking ballads that had the men joining in with rough off-key voices. The lucky benediction, which had been moderately full when Thomas Lerner began playing, was packed within the hour. Word had spread quickly in the small town. A real piano player, someone said, not just banging on keys but actually playing like they do back east, like civilization itself had walked through the door. Men came in from the boarding houses and the tents at the edge of town. They ordered drinks they could not afford and lingered at the bar, transfixed by the music pouring from the corner. Charlotte watched from her position near the till, keeping careful track of the glasses Esteban poured and the coins that crossed the bar. But even she found her attention drawn repeatedly to the piano, to the way Thomas Lerner's fingers moved across the keys with such certainty, such command. There was something mesmerizing about it, something that went beyond mere skill. When he played, the world outside seemed to fall away. The failing silver mines, the encroaching desert, the slow death of the town itself, all of it receded into insignificance beneath the spell of music. Sam was delighted. This was exactly what he had imagined when he had first thought about getting a piano. This sense of occasion, this transformation of his shabby establishment into something approaching elegant. He watched his customers drink and spend, and he calculated rapidly how much more they might spend if this became a regular occurrence. When Thomas Lerner finally stopped playing near midnight, his fingers stilling on the keys with a final gentle chord, Sam immediately approached him with an offer. Would Mr. Lerner consider staying in Redemption Flats for a while? Sam could offer him a room upstairs, meals, and a percentage of the bar's take on the nights he played. It was not much, Sam admitted, but it was honest work, and the accommodations, while spare, were clean. Thomas Lerner listened to the offer with his head tilted slightly, as if hearing music in the words themselves. Then he smiled that slight smile again and said he supposed he could delay his journey to California for a time. He had nowhere urgent to be, and the piano was a fine instrument. It would be a shame not to play it. They shook hands on it, and Sam felt a surge of satisfaction. The mysterious piano had found its player. The lucky benediction had found its attraction. Things, he thought, were finally looking up. Thomas Lerner took up residence in one of the empty rooms on the second floor. It had been unused for months, and Charlotte spent an afternoon cleaning it, sweeping out the dust and mouse droppings, replacing the thin mattress on the iron bed frame, hanging a clean sheet over the window that looked out onto Main Street. She brought up a pitcher and basin for washing, a lamp with clean oil, and a chair that did not wobble too badly. When Thomas came upstairs to inspect his new quarters, he thanked her graciously and said it would do perfectly well. He played every night thereafter. Word continued to spread beyond Redemption Flats, carried by cowboys riding circuit and teamsters making their routes. Within 2 weeks, the Lucky Benediction was seeing customers from surrounding ranches and even from Gila Bend, 20 miles to the west. Men would ride for hours just to hear the piano player, to sit in that shabby saloon, and let Thomas Lerner transport them somewhere else with his music. Sam had to order more whiskey and beer than he had stocked in a year. The till was fuller than it had been since the silver boom. Charlotte found herself smiling occasionally, a rare occurrence that Esteban noticed and mentioned to Sam, who merely nodded and said music had a way of lifting spirits. Thomas Lerner was a quiet man off the piano bench. He took his meals alone in his room or at a corner table in the saloon during the afternoon lull. He did not drink to excess, did not gamble, did not visit the remaining prostitutes who still worked out of a sad little house at the end of Perdition Street. He was polite to everyone but friendly with no one. When he was not playing, he would sometimes take walks into the desert, following no particular path, just wandering among the sagebrush and creosote until the heat drove him back to shade. Charlotte watched him sometimes from the window, a dark figure moving through the white landscape, and wondered what he was looking for out there, or what he was trying to leave behind. It was near the end of November when things began to change. The first incident was so subtle that it was not immediately recognized as an incident at all. An old miner named Calloway, who had worked the Covenant Hills since the beginning and who was now dying slowly from the silica dust that had filled his lungs over the years, came into the Lucky Benediction on a Wednesday evening. He was alone, which was unusual. Calloway normally came in with a small group of fellow veterans from the early days, men who shared his affliction and his memories. But on this night, he entered by himself, his breathing labored, his face gray beneath the permanent dirt that no amount of washing could remove from his pores. He sat at a table near the piano, ordered a whiskey, and waited for Thomas Lerner to begin playing. When the music started, Calloway closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, his expression relaxing into something approaching peace. Thomas played for nearly an hour, moving through his usual repertoire, and Calloway sat perfectly still, listening. Then, during a particularly soft piece that none of them recognized, something in the music seemed to shift. The melody became slower, more deliberate, and took on a quality that was difficult to describe, a kind of sadness that went beyond the notes themselves. Calloway opened his eyes. Tears were running down his weathered face, cutting clean tracks through the dust. He stared at Thomas Lerner with an expression of profound recognition, as if he had just heard something he had been waiting his entire life to hear. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked unsteadily toward the door. No one stopped him. No one said anything. He pushed through the doors and disappeared into the night. They found him the next morning. He had walked out into the desert, following the old trail to the Covenant Hills, and had lain down in the shadow of a Joshua tree. He looked peaceful, they said, more peaceful than anyone could remember seeing him in life. His eyes were closed, his hands were folded on his chest, and his face in death had lost the gray pallor and looked almost young again, almost like the man he must have been before the dust and the work and the disappointment. Sam heard about Calloway's death from the sheriff, a tired man named Porter, who served largely as an administrator of the inevitable in a place where death was common enough to require little investigation, unless it was obviously violent. Porter mentioned that it was probably the lungs that finally gave out, that Calloway had been living on borrowed time for months, and that at least he had gone peacefully. Sam agreed and thought nothing more of it. But Charlotte had been in the saloon the night before. She had seen Calloway's face when the music changed. She had seen the tears, the strange recognition, the way he had left as if summoned by something only he could hear. She said nothing to her father, but she watched Thomas Lerner more carefully after that, paying attention to the moments when his playing shifted into those slower, sadder melodies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the instrument itself. The second incident occurred a week later. A cowboy named Jim Driscoll, who worked for the Double R Ranch north of town, came into the Lucky Benediction on a Saturday night. He was celebrating, he told everyone loudly. He had just received word that his brother back in Missouri, who had been sick for months, had recovered and was going to live. Driscoll bought a round for the house, which consisted of about 15 men, and declared that life was good, and God was merciful, and everyone should drink to health and family. Thomas Lerner was playing when Driscoll made his announcement. He nodded politely at the cowboy's good news and continued with his music. But then, as the night wore on and Driscoll became increasingly drunk and sentimental, the music began to change again. That same shift, that movement into something slower and deeper, a melody that seemed to pull at something inside the chest. Driscoll stopped talking mid-sentence. His face, which had been flushed with alcohol and joy, went pale. He stood up from his table, swaying slightly, and stared at the piano with an expression that Charlotte would later describe as horror. He left the saloon without a word, without paying his tab, without even collecting his hat. He rode out of town that night, and the next morning, the Double R sent a man to Redemption Flats to inquire about him. Driscoll's horse had returned to the ranch without its rider. They found Driscoll 2 days later, or what the buzzards had left of him. He had apparently been thrown from his horse in a ravine about 5 miles outside of town. His neck was broken, his body already being reclaimed by the desert. The horse showed no signs of having been spooked by a snake or a gunshot. It had simply run, and Driscoll had simply fallen. And that was the end of Jim Driscoll, who had been celebrating the life of his brother. Charlotte mentioned the coincidence to her father. 2 men, 2 strange reactions to the music, 2 deaths within days. Sam dismissed her concerns. Men died all the time in the territory, he said. Miners died of dust and accidents. Cowboys died from horse falls and drownings and a dozen other mundane disasters. It was tragic, but not mysterious. The music had nothing to do with it. Thomas Lerner was a piano player, not a curse. Charlotte let the subject drop, but she did not stop watching. The 3rd incident removed all doubt. Daniel Stokes was a gambling man, a professional who traveled the mining camps and cattle towns, making his living from cards and dice and the weaknesses of men who believed they could beat odds that were carefully stacked against them. He was good at what he did, good enough to live well, but not so good as to get himself shot. He knew when to win and when to lose, how to read a room, how to leave before suspicion turned to violence. He had been in Redemption Flats for 2 weeks, taking money slowly and carefully from the local men who thought they understood poker. Stokes was sitting at his usual table on a Thursday evening when Thomas Lerner began to play. The gambler was in the middle of a hand, watching his opponents carefully, calculating odds and tells, and the best way to extract maximum value from the mediocre cards he held. But when the music began, when Thomas's fingers found those particular notes that seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below normal hearing, Stokes froze. His cards fell from his hands and scattered on the table. His face went white, then gray, then took on a waxy quality that made him look already dead. He stood up. The other players at the table called to him, asked him what was wrong, tried to get him to sit back down. But Stokes did not seem to hear them. He walked toward the piano like a man in a trance, his eyes fixed on Thomas Lerner, his mouth working but producing no sound. When he reached the piano, he leaned close to Thomas, close enough that only the player could have heard what he said. Thomas did not stop playing. His fingers continued their movement across the keys, but his gray eyes lifted to meet Stokes's gaze, and something passed between them, some communication that required no words. Stokes backed away from the piano. He turned and walked to the bar, where Esteban was polishing glasses. He asked for whiskey. Esteban poured. Stokes drank the entire glass in one swallow, then asked for another. He drank that too. Then he said, very clearly and very calmly, that he was going to die tonight and that he wanted someone to write to his sister in Denver and tell her that he had always loved her and that he was sorry for the man he had been. Esteban, who had seen many strange things in his time in Redemption Flats, nevertheless felt a chill at these words. He asked Stokes what he meant. Stokes just smiled, a sad smile that seemed to acknowledge the absurdity of explaining the inexplicable, and said that the music had told him. The music always knows. Then he left the saloon. Sam tried to follow him, concerned now, despite his earlier skepticism. But Stokes moved quickly, and by the time Sam reached the street, the gambler had disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the saloon's lights. They searched for him that night, Sam and Esteban and several patrons who had heard Stokes's strange pronouncement. They found nothing. The next morning, a boy discovered Stokes's body behind the old assayer's office. He was sitting with his back against the wall, his hands in his lap, his eyes open and staring at nothing. There was no mark on him, no wound, no sign of violence or struggle. The doctor, such as he was, examined the body and declared that Stokes's heart had simply stopped. It happened sometimes, the doctor said. Men died of heart failure. It was not particularly unusual, especially in men who lived hard lives. But Charlotte knew better now, and Sam could no longer deny what he was seeing. 3 men had heard something in Thomas Lerner's music. 3 men had reacted with recognition and fear. 3 men had died within hours. And each time, the music had changed in that particular way, had taken on that quality of deep, knowing sadness that seemed to reach into the listener and pull something loose. That night, after closing, Sam confronted Thomas. He asked the piano player directly what was happening, what it was about the music that seemed to precede death. Thomas sat at the piano, his long fingers resting gently on the closed lid, and considered the question. Then he told Sam the truth, or a version of it. The piano, Thomas said, was not like other instruments. It had been built by a man named Jacob Schiller in Boston in 1876, during the centennial year when America was celebrating its first century of existence. Jacob Schiller was a craftsman of extraordinary skill but troubled mind. He had lost his wife and 3 children to cholera in 1873, and the grief had broken something in him. He became obsessed with the idea that death was not an ending but a passage, and that those who were about to pass through needed guidance, needed to hear the music of transition. Jacob spent 3 years building the piano that now sat in the lucky benediction. He used wood from a tree that had been struck by lightning. He incorporated into its construction small relics that he gathered from cemeteries and morgues. A piece of coffin wood, a splinter from a gallows, a string made from catgut that had been prepared by an undertaker. He tuned the piano not to concert pitch, but to frequencies that he believed corresponded to the threshold between life and death. When it was finished, he gave a single concert in his workshop, playing for an audience that existed only in his mind. The next day, everyone who lived within hearing distance of that workshop died. 17 people in total, including Jacob Schiller himself. The piano was found among their bodies, untouched, perfect, waiting. It was sold as part of the estate to cover debts. It passed through several owners, and wherever it went, it brought death to those who were ready to die, those whose time had come or was coming soon. The piano could sense it, Thomas explained. It could feel the approach of death the way some animals can feel an earthquake before the ground begins to shake. And when it felt that imminence, it would play a certain way, calling to those who needed to hear their farewell. Sam listened to this explanation with growing horror. He asked Thomas why, if he knew this, he continued to play the instrument. Why had he come to Redemption Flats at all? Thomas's answer was simple and terrible. He was the piano's keeper. He had been drawn to it, just as it had been drawn to him. He could no more stop playing it than he could stop breathing. And the piano needed to be played. It was built for this purpose, and purpose once imbued cannot be unmade. Sam demanded that Thomas leave. "Take the piano and go," he said. He wanted no more death in his establishment, no more strange occurrences. But Thomas shook his head slowly. The piano had been delivered here for a reason, he said. Redemption Flats needed it, though Sam might not understand why. There were many in this town who carried death with them, who were ready to pass but did not know how to let go. The piano would help them. It would give them permission to release their grip on life. It was, in its way, a mercy. Sam did not see it as mercy. He saw it as murder, or something worse than murder. But when he looked into Thomas's gray eyes, he saw no malice, no cruelty, only a kind of resigned acceptance of a role that had been assigned and could not be refused. Sam went to bed that night deeply troubled, lying awake in his room above the saloon, listening to the wind whistle through gaps in the walls and wondering what he had brought into his establishment. Charlotte spoke with Thomas the next day. She found him in the afternoon, sitting at the piano, though not playing, his hands resting on the keys as if feeling for vibrations beneath the surface. She asked him if what he had told her father was true. Thomas confirmed that it was. She asked him how many people the piano had killed. Thomas corrected her. The piano killed no one, he said. It merely sang to those who were already dying, who already carried their death inside them like a seed waiting to sprout. It gave them a kind of music that made the passage easier, that turned the terror of oblivion into something almost beautiful. Charlotte asked the question that had been troubling her most. Could the piano sense death in anyone, or only in some people? Thomas said that it sensed those who were close, those for whom death was a matter of days or weeks, not years. but its accuracy was absolute. When it played that particular melody, when it called to someone, that person would not see another dawn. Charlotte felt cold despite the afternoon heat. She asked if Thomas could control it, if he could choose not to play those melodies. Thomas said he could not. When the piano sensed someone in the room who was ready, it demanded to be played in that way. His hands would move of their own accord. The music would come through him, but not from him. He was merely the instrument's instrument, the medium through which it spoke. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. The lucky benediction remained busy. Men still came to hear the piano player, drawn by the beauty of the music and unaware of its darker purpose. And every few days, the music would change. Someone in the room would hear their personal farewell, would recognize in those notes the shape of their own ending, and within hours, they would be dead. A ranch hand named Cooper died when his horse rolled over him during a river crossing. A washerwoman named Mary Chin died in her sleep, her heart simply stopping in the night. A drifter with no name died from a rattlesnake bite behind the livery stable. A young man named Peter Gillis, barely 20, died from a burst appendix that came on so suddenly he did not have time to understand what was happening. Each of them had been in the saloon the night before their death. Each of them had heard the music change. Each of them had left with that same expression of recognition and resigned acceptance. The town began to notice. How could they not? The deaths were mounting, and while each could be explained individually by the harsh realities of frontier life, the pattern was becoming undeniable. People began to whisper about the piano, about Thomas Lerner, about whether the lucky benediction had become a place of doom rather than entertainment. Some men stopped coming to the saloon altogether, afraid that they might hear their own death foretold in the music. Others came more frequently, driven by a morbid curiosity or a fatalistic desire to know their fate. Sam's business, paradoxically, improved. The saloon took on a dark glamour. Men would dare each other to spend an evening there, to see if the music would call to them. It became a test of courage, or fatalism, or simple stupidity. Sam was making more money than he had since the silver boom, but he felt sick about it. He was profiting from death, from terror, from the darkest kind of spectacle. But he could not bring himself to close the saloon, to destroy his livelihood, to admit that he was powerless before whatever force had taken up residence in his establishment. Charlotte became obsessed with the piano. She would watch Thomas play for hours, studying his hands, his face, trying to understand the moment when the music shifted from mere beauty into prophecy. She began to recognize the signs. A certain tension would enter his shoulders. His breathing would slow. His eyes would become unfocused as if looking at something beyond the room. And then the melody would change, would drop into those lower registers and take on that quality of deep, inevitable sadness. She also began to notice something else. Thomas was changing. He was growing thinner, more gaunt. His face, which had been difficult to read, was becoming almost translucent, as if he was slowly fading, becoming less substantial. The gray of his eyes had deepened until they looked like holes. He ate less, spoke less, seemed to exist more and more entirely within the music itself. Charlotte wondered if the piano was consuming him, if being its instrument required the slow sacrifice of his own substance. In early December, something unprecedented happened. A woman came to hear the music. Her name was Elizabeth Byrne, and she was the wife of the town's only remaining merchant of any substance, a man named Harold Byrne, who ran a dry goods store that served the ranches and the few remaining miners. Elizabeth was 42 years old, handsome rather than beautiful, with prematurely gray hair that she wore in a tight bun. She was known as a respectable woman, religious, who attended the small Methodist church at the edge of town and who involved herself in the minimal charitable work that a place like Redemption Flats could support. Elizabeth had never set foot in the lucky benediction. Women of her station did not frequent saloons, but she had heard about the music, had heard the whispers about its strange effects, and she had decided, for reasons she did not fully articulate even to herself, that she needed to hear it. She came on a Wednesday evening, accompanied by her husband, who looked uncomfortable in the saloon's rough environment, but who would not let his wife enter such a place unescorted. They took a table near the back. Harold ordered sarsaparilla for both of them, which occasioned some poorly suppressed amusement from the other patrons. When Thomas began to play, Elizabeth leaned forward, her attention completely focused on the piano. Thomas played several standard pieces, pleasant melodies that the crowd knew and appreciated. But then, inevitably, the music changed. Elizabeth's face transformed. The color drained from it, leaving her corpse pale in the lamplight. Her hands, which had been folded primly on the table, began to shake. She stood up suddenly, her chair falling backward with a crash. Harold grabbed her arm, asked her what was wrong, but Elizabeth did not seem to hear him. She walked toward the piano, as if pulled by an invisible cord. When she reached Thomas, she leaned down and whispered something that no one else could hear. Thomas's hands stilled on the keys. He looked up at her, his gray eyes meeting hers, and nodded once. Elizabeth straightened, turned, and walked out of the saloon with great dignity, her head high, her step steady despite the obvious terror in her eyes. Harold followed, calling her name, but she did not acknowledge him. The next morning, Elizabeth Byrne was found dead in her bedroom. She had drunk a bottle of laudanum during the night, enough to ensure that she would not wake. There was a note on the nightstand, addressed to her husband. In it, she confessed that she had known for months that she was dying. There was a growth in her breast, hidden beneath her corset and her modesty. She had told no one, had borne the increasing pain in silence, had tried to maintain her dignity and her household as if nothing was wrong. But the night before, she wrote, she had heard music that told her the time had come, that the pain would soon be unbearable, that it was time to choose her own exit rather than wait for the disease to destroy her piece by piece. She apologized to Harold for her weakness, asked for his forgiveness, and expressed hope that they would be reunited in a better place. Harold Byrne came to the lucky benediction that afternoon. He was a broken man, aged overnight by grief and incomprehension. He found Sam behind the bar and demanded to know what had happened, what was wrong with the music, what dark power his saloon was harboring. Sam, who had no answers that would comfort, could only shake his head and offer condolences. But Harold was not interested in condolences. He wanted someone to blame, something to strike out against. He went to the piano, where Thomas sat as he often did during the quiet afternoon hours, and accused him of being a witch, a demon, an agent of death. Thomas listened to the accusations calmly, his gray eyes betraying no emotion. When Harold finally ran out of words, gasping and sobbing, Thomas spoke quietly. He told Harold that his wife had been in great pain, that the music had not killed her, but had given her the courage to end her own suffering before it became intolerable. It was not cruelty, Thomas said, but compassion. The piano sang what needed to be sung. Harold struck him. His fist connected with Thomas's jaw, snapping his head to the side. Thomas did not fight back, did not even raise his hands to defend himself. Harold hit him again, and then again, until Esteban pulled him away and held him while he wept. They put Harold in a chair and gave him whiskey, and after a time, his grief subsided into a kind of numb acceptance. He left the saloon without another word, walking back to his store and his empty house, and a life that would never again be what it had been. Thomas touched his jaw, which was already swelling, and returned to the piano. His fingers found the keys, and he began to play again, a soft, mournful melody that seemed to apologize for everything and nothing. That night, Sam made his decision. This had to end. He did not care about the money, did not care about the crowds. The lucky benediction had become a charnel house, a place where death was not just present, but invited, celebrated, facilitated. He would close the saloon if he had to, would sell it, would burn it down if that was what it took to stop the dying. He told Thomas that he had to leave, take the piano and go anywhere, go to California, go back east, go to hell for all Sam cared, but go. This town had suffered enough. Thomas listened without argument. He nodded slowly and said he would leave in the morning, but he asked for one final night, one last evening to play. The piano needed to finish its work here, he said. There were still people in Redemption Flats who carried death with them, who needed to hear their song. To stop now would be cruel. Sam wanted to refuse, but something in Thomas's eyes, or perhaps in his own exhausted fatalism, made him agree. One more night, then it would be over. Word spread quickly that this would be Thomas Lerner's final performance at the Lucky Benediction. The saloon filled beyond capacity that evening. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed against the walls, spilled out onto the street. They came from the surrounding ranches, from Gila Bend, from camps and homesteads whose names appeared on no map. They came to witness the end of something they did not fully understand but felt was significant, a closing of a chapter in the town's dark history. Thomas played for hours. He played every song he knew, every melody he had ever performed. He played the classical pieces that showcased his technical skill. He played the popular songs that brought tears to eyes and voices to lips. He played dancing tunes and marching songs and ballads of lost love and distant homes. And as the night deepened, as midnight approached and then passed, the music began to change. It happened gradually, a slow shift that at first seemed like natural transition, but that soon became something else entirely. The melody dropped into those familiar lower registers, took on that quality of knowing sadness. But this time it was different. This time it did not call to one person. It called to many. Men throughout the room stiffened, their faces draining of color. Charlotte, watching from her position near the till, counted them. 7. No. 9. No, more than that. A dozen men had heard their names in the music. She could see it in their eyes, the recognition, the acceptance, the terror. They stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from the piano where Thomas's hands moved with increasing speed, with frantic energy, as if he was trying to finish something before time ran out. The melody grew louder, more insistent. It filled the saloon and spilled out into the street and echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. It seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. And still the men stood transfixed, listening to music that told them their time had come. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. Thomas's hands fell from the keys. He slumped forward, his forehead resting on the music stand, his breathing labored. The room remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The men who had heard their names in the music began slowly to leave. They walked out into the night, dispersing into the darkness like ghosts, their faces blank, their steps mechanical. Charlotte went to Thomas. She touched his shoulder and asked if he was all right. He lifted his head slowly and she gasped. His face had aged decades in the space of hours. His skin was pulled tight over his skull. His eyes, those gray eyes, were filmed over, nearly blind. He tried to speak but could produce only a whisper. "The piano," he said. The piano had taken everything. It was done now. It had found everyone it needed to find. It could rest. Thomas tried to stand, but collapsed. Esteban caught him and carried him upstairs to his room, laying him on the narrow bed. Charlotte brought water, but Thomas could not drink. His breathing was shallow, rattling. Sam stood in the doorway, watching, feeling helpless. Thomas's eyes found him in the dimness, and he smiled that slight smile one last time. He whispered that the piano belonged to Sam now, that it would stay silent unless it was needed again, and that perhaps that was for the best. Then his eyes closed and his breathing stopped, and Thomas Lerner, keeper of the piano, player of death songs, was gone. They buried him in the morning, in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Redemption Flats. There was no service, no eulogy. The Methodist preacher refused to officiate for a man he considered to have been in league with dark forces. So Sam and Esteban and Charlotte dug the grave themselves and rolled Thomas's body, wrapped in a sheet, into the hard ground. Charlotte said a brief prayer, though she was not sure if it was appropriate or if anyone was listening. Then they covered him over and walked back to town as the sun rose over the desert. Over the next 3 days, 11 men died in Redemption Flats and the surrounding area. They died in a variety of ways, each death explicable in isolation, but collectively forming an undeniable pattern. A fall from a roof, a blood infection that came on suddenly, a riding accident, a shooting that was ruled accidental, a drowning in a creek that was barely deep enough to cover a man's ankles. Each victim had been in the lucky benediction on that final night. Each had heard the music call to them. The 12th death was Harold Byrne. He hanged himself in his store, unable to bear his grief and perhaps unable to live with the knowledge that his wife's death had been foreseen and might have been prevented if the piano had never come to Redemption Flats. They found him in the morning, swinging gently from a rafter, his face peaceful. The dying stopped after that. The piano sat silent in the corner of the lucky benediction, its lid closed, its keys untouched. Sam could not bring himself to have it removed or destroyed. It was too valuable, too beautiful, and some part of him believed Thomas's final words, that it would remain quiet unless needed. So it stayed. a memento of those strange months, a reminder of what had happened. Business at the Lucky Benediction returned to normal, or what passed for normal, in a dying mining town. Men came for drinks, for company, for the illusion of civilization in a place where civilization had never truly taken root. They did not ask about the piano. They did not mention Thomas Lerner. It was as if a collective agreement had been reached to forget, or at least to pretend to forget. Charlotte sometimes found herself standing near the piano during quiet afternoons, looking at its closed lid, wondering if it would ever play again. She would think about Thomas, about the men who had died, about her mother whom she barely remembered, and who had died when Charlotte was still a child. She wondered if the piano would have called to her mother, if such an instrument could have given her warning, permission, solace. She did not know. There were no answers, only the silence of the keys and the endless dust and the wind that blew through Redemption Flats as it blew through all forgotten places. Years passed. The town continued its slow decline. Sam grew older, grayer, more stooped. Charlotte remained bound by duty or habit, or the simple impossibility of imagining life anywhere else. Esteban stayed as well, loyal to the end, though what he was loyal to neither Sam nor Charlotte could say. The piano gathered dust in its corner, untouched, unmourned, a relic of a time that people preferred not to remember. Then, in the spring of 1902, a decade after Thomas Lerner had walked into town, Sam fell ill. It was nothing dramatic, just a fever that would not break, a weakness that spread through his body like water through dry ground. The doctor, now a different man than the one who had been in Redemption Flats during the time of the piano, said it was probably influenza, that Sam should rest, that he would either recover or he would not, that such was the way of things. Charlotte nursed her father through the days and nights, bringing him soup he could not eat, water he could not keep down, damp cloths for his burning forehead. She sat with him in his room above the saloon, listening to his labored breathing, watching him fade. On the fourth night of his illness, she heard music. It came from downstairs, from the saloon that was closed and empty and locked. It was piano music, slow and sad and familiar, though she could not place where she had heard it before. Charlotte left her father's bedside and descended the stairs, following the sound. The saloon was dark except for a bar of moonlight coming through the window, and in the corner, the piano was playing. There was no one at the keys. The bench was empty, but the keys themselves were moving, depressing and rising as if pressed by invisible fingers. The music that emerged was the same melody Thomas Lerner had played on those nights when death was near. That quality of deep, knowing sadness, that song of farewell. Charlotte understood. She walked to the piano and stood before it, watching the keys move, listening to the music meant for her father. Tears ran down her face, but she did not try to stop them. After a time, the music ended. The keys stilled. The piano was once again just an instrument, just wood and wire and ivory, silent and waiting. She returned to her father's room. Sam's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but he was not seeing it. He was seeing something else, somewhere else, whatever lay beyond the door that was opening for him. Charlotte took his hand and held it. She told him it was all right to go, that he had done enough, that he could rest. Sam's eyes focused on her for a moment, recognizing her, grateful. Then he exhaled, a long, slow breath that did not end in an inhale, and he was gone. Charlotte sat with him until morning, holding his cold hand, listening to the silence of the saloon below. When the sun rose, she washed his body and dressed him in his best suit and made the arrangements for his burial. She did not cry again. There was work to be done, and crying would not bring him back. They buried Sam next to Thomas Lerner in the cemetery on the hill. Charlotte stood at the graveside with Esteban and a handful of men who had known her father, and she thought about the piano, about the music, about the mercy and the cruelty of knowing when the end was near. She did not know if the piano would play again, if it would call to her someday when her own time came. She suspected it would, and in a strange way, she found that thought almost comforting. The Lucky Benediction closed not long after. Charlotte could not run it alone, and Esteban had decided it was time to move on, to see what lay beyond Redemption Flats, to spend his remaining years somewhere else. They sold what they could, left what they could not sell, and locked the doors. The piano remained inside, silent in its corner, waiting. Redemption Flats became a ghost town within 5 years. The remaining residents drifted away, following rumors of new silver strikes or simply giving up on the frontier entirely. The buildings collapsed or burned, or were slowly dismantled by scavengers looking for salvageable wood. The church fell in on itself. The general store was gutted by fire. The houses at the edge of town filled with sand. But the lucky benediction remained standing, its walls intact, its roof still mostly sound. And inside, if you were brave enough or foolish enough to enter, you could still find the piano in its corner, covered in dust, silent, waiting. Local legends grew up around it, stories of cursed music and death songs, of a piano that played for ghosts, of melodies that called to the dying. Most dismissed these as frontier superstition, the kind of tales that emerged naturally in isolated places where reality and imagination blurred together. But every so often, someone passing through the ruins of Redemption Flats would swear they heard music coming from the abandoned saloon. Piano music, slow and sad, playing a melody that seemed to reach into the chest and pull at something vital. And those who heard it would leave quickly, hurrying back to their cars or horses, eager to put distance between themselves and that sound, that song of farewell, that music that played only for the recently dead. The piano waits still. In the darkness of the lucky benediction, in the ghost town of Redemption Flats, in the Arizona desert where the wind blows across red rock and alkali flats, the piano waits. Its keys are ready. Its strings are tuned. And when the time is right, when someone enters that space who carries death close enough to feel, the piano will play again. It will play its song, the only song it knows, the song that has no beginning and no end, the song that is mercy and murder, and truth, all at once. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some instruments were never meant to be built. And some music, once heard, cannot be forgotten, no matter how many years pass, no matter how far you run, because it is not just music. It is prophecy. It is farewell. It is the sound of the door opening, the sound of what waits on the other side, the sound that will come for all of us eventually, in our time, when the piano knows we are ready, whether we know it ourselves or not.